The autumn wind whispered through the trees of Central Park, carrying with it the first hints of winter's approach. Officer Michael Sullivan adjusted his police cap, scanning the gathering dusk with eyes hardened by 23 years on the force. The recent surge in park robberies had everyone on edge, and tonight's patrol felt different, tenser, more electric. His boots crunched on fallen leaves as he made his way along the winding paths. The setting sun painted the sky in deep oranges and purples, casting long shadows across the park's familiar landscape. Sullivan checked his watch. 6:45 p.m. The early darkness of fall meant more opportunities for criminals, or at least that's what his experience told him. Unit 247, checking in at Bethesda Fountain. He spoke into his radio, voice gruff from years of barking orders. The response came back crisp and clear, acknowledging his position. The fountain area was relatively quiet, with only a few joggers and dog walkers hurrying home before dark. Sullivan's trained eye cataloged each person: an elderly woman with a poodle, a young couple taking selfies, 2 teenagers on skateboards. Normal evening activities, nothing suspicious. Then he saw him. A tall black man in a dark jacket, moving swiftly through the shadows near the fountain's northern edge. Sullivan's hand instinctively moved to his holster, his mind already running through recent suspect descriptions. 3 robberies in the past week, all described as committed by a tall black male in dark clothing. "Hey, NYPD, stop right there!" Sullivan's voice boomed across the empty park space. The figure continued walking, either not hearing or choosing to ignore the command. Sullivan's pace quickened, his boots heavy on the damp pavement. "I said stop!" The man finally turned, his hands raised slightly but his stance confident. "Is there a problem, officer?" His voice was calm, measured, too calm for Sullivan's liking. "Let's see some ID. What are you doing in the park at this hour?" Sullivan demanded, his flashlight beam steady on the man's face. He noted the expensive-looking suit beneath the jacket, but that meant nothing. Criminals came in all forms these days. "I'm heading home from work," the man replied, reaching slowly for his inside pocket. "My name is Marcus Thompson. And I'm—" "Keep your hands where I can see them," Sullivan barked, drawing his weapon. The tension in the air thickened like smoke. Several passers-by stopped to watch, phones appearing in hands. "Recording the confrontation. Officer, I'm reaching for my credentials. I'm an FBI agent." Thompson's voice remained steady, but his eyes hardened. "If you'll allow me." "On your knees, now." Sullivan wasn't listening anymore. Years of ingrained prejudices and fear clouded his judgment. He saw what he expected to see, a threat, not a fellow law enforcement officer. Thompson slowly complied, his movements deliberate. "Officer Sullivan, yes, I can see your name tag. You're making a serious mistake. I'm conducting an authorized surveillance operation." Sullivan's radio crackled to life. "Unit 247, do you need backup?" "Affirmative. Suspect detained at Bethesda Fountain. Possible match to robbery suspect description." Sullivan's voice was clipped, professional, even as his heart raced. The gathering crowd grew larger, murmurs of discontent rippling through the onlookers. Phones recorded every moment, every word. Sullivan could feel the weight of their judgment, but he pressed on. This was procedure. This was protocol. Thompson remained on his knees, hands behind his head. "Officer, in my right inside jacket pocket, you'll find my FBI credentials. I suggest you check them before this situation escalates further." "Quiet!" Sullivan snapped, moving to handcuff Thompson. As he reached for the man's wrists, a black leather wallet fell from Thompson's jacket pocket, landing open on the ground. The golden shield of an FBI badge caught the beam of Sullivan's flashlight. Officer Jenny Martinez arrived first, her patrol car's lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. She took in the situation quickly: the kneeling man, the growing crowd, the phone cameras, and the fallen badge. "Sully, stop. He's FBI." Martinez's voice cut through the chaos. She moved forward, picking up the credentials. "Agent Marcus Thompson, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The realization hit Sullivan like a physical blow. Time seemed to freeze as the implications of his actions crashed over him. He lowered his weapon slowly, horror creeping into his consciousness. Thompson stood, brushing off his suit pants with deliberate movements. "Officer Sullivan, I trust you understand the severity of what just transpired here. I'll be speaking with your superior officers, and I expect this won't be the last time we interact." The crowd had grown larger still, their phones capturing every moment of Sullivan's humiliation. Social media would have this story within minutes. His mistake would be viral before he even finished his shift. Martinez approached Sullivan, her voice low. "Sully, you need to call this in. Captain Chin needs to know about this now, not when it hits the news." Sullivan holstered his weapon, his hands shaking slightly. 23 years on the force. And he'd never made a mistake this massive, this public. He watched as Thompson spoke quietly into his own phone, no doubt contacting his FBI superiors. The autumn wind continued to blow through Central Park, but now it felt colder, more biting. Sullivan's radio crackled again, this time with Captain Chen's voice. "Officer Sullivan, report to my office immediately after your shift. We need to discuss tonight's incident." As Thompson walked away, his dignity intact despite the ordeal, Sullivan couldn't help but notice how the crowd parted for him, how their phones followed his departure. The agent's final words hung in the air. "Change is coming, Officer Sullivan. Whether you're ready for it or not." The incident at Bethesda Fountain lasted less than 15 minutes, but Sullivan knew his life would never be the same. As he watched the crowd disperse and the night settle back into its routine, he felt the weight of his badge differently for the first time in his career. It wasn't just a symbol of authority anymore. It was a reminder of responsibility, and tonight, he had failed to honor that responsibility. Martinez touched his arm gently. "Come on, Sully. Let's get back to the station. This is going to be a long night." The fluorescent lights in Captain Sarah Chen's office buzzed with an irritating persistence the next morning. Sullivan sat rigid in an uncomfortable chair, his uniform feeling unusually tight around his neck. Across the desk, Captain Chen studied the viral video on her computer screen for the third time. Her expression unreadable. 7 million views. Sullivan. 7 million in just 12 hours. Chin finally broke the silence, turning the screen so he could see the damning footage. "And that's just on Twitter. It's everywhere now. Facebook, Instagram, national news networks. The FBI director himself called me at 5 a.m. Agent Thompson stood by the window, his reflection visible in the glass. His suit was immaculate, creating a stark contrast to Sullivan's haggard appearance after a sleepless night. "Captain Chen," Thompson spoke without turning. "The Bureau is particularly concerned about the timing. This incident has compromised an ongoing investigation that's been in place for 6 months." Chen nodded, pulling out a thick file. "Let's review the sequence of events. Officer Sullivan, you were on routine patrol in Central Park." "Yes, Captain," Sullivan cleared his throat. "We'd had multiple robbery reports in the area. The suspect description." "A tall black male in dark clothing," Thompson interrupted, finally turning from the window. "Rather broad parameters, wouldn't you say, officer?" Sullivan felt heat rise in his face. "Sir, I was following protocol. The location, the time of day, the matching description." "The protocol?" Thompson moved closer, his voice controlled but intense. "Does your protocol include ignoring a federal agent's attempt to identify himself? Does it include drawing your weapon on an unarmed man who was clearly cooperating?" "Gentlemen," Chen interjected, "let's keep this professional." She turned to Sullivan. "Your body cam footage shows Agent Thompson attempting to reach for his credentials multiple times. Why didn't you allow him to identify himself?" The question hung in the air. Sullivan shifted in his chair, aware of the sweat forming on his brow. I perceived a potential threat. In the moment, You saw what you expected to see," Thompson finished. "A black man in the park after dark must be a criminal, right?" The words hit Sullivan like physical blows. He wanted to defend himself, to explain about the robberies, the matching description, the safety protocols. But sitting here in the harsh morning light, his justifications felt hollow. Internal Affairs will be conducting a full investigation, Chen continued. Officer Sullivan, you're on administrative leave effective immediately. I'll need your badge and weapon. Sullivan's hand moved to his belt, fingers trembling slightly as he unholstered his service weapon. The badge felt heavy as he placed it on Chen's desk, a weight he'd carried proudly for over 2 decades. The FBI will be conducting its own investigation, Thompson added. Not just into last night's incident, but into the pattern of stops and arrests in this precinct over the past 5 years. We're particularly interested in examining racial disparities in use of force incidents. Chen nodded grimly. We'll cooperate fully with both investigations. Officer Sullivan. The department will provide legal representation, but you may want to consider private counsel as well. A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Martinez entered, carrying a stack of papers. Captain, the press is gathering outside. They're requesting a statement. Chen sighed, rubbing her temples. Tell them we'll have a press conference at 2 p.m. And Sullivan, go home through the back entrance. There are protesters gathering at the front. Protesters. Sullivan's voice cracked slightly. Your name and photo are all over social media. Martinez explained gently. People are angry. They're calling for your resignation, demanding reform. Reform that's long overdue, Thompson interjected. Captain Chen. The FBI has been monitoring complaints against this precinct for some time. Last night's incident may have been the catalyst we needed for a broader investigation into departmental practices. Sullivan sat in stunned silence as the implications washed over him. One incident, one mistake, and his entire career was unraveling. But was it really just one mistake? Thompson's words about patterns and disparities echoed in his mind. The department will be implementing immediate changes, Chen announced. Mandatory retraining for all officers, with emphasis on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. We're also reviewing all stop-and-frisk procedures and use of force protocols. That's a start, Thompson acknowledged. But the FBI will be looking for more substantial reforms. Community oversight, independent review boards, transparent disciplinary procedures. Sullivan found his voice. Captain, I've served this department faithfully for 23 years. My record. Your record shows a consistent pattern of disproportionate stops and searches of minority subjects. Chen cut him off. Opening another file. IA has already pulled the statistics. The numbers don't lie, Sullivan. Martinez shifted uncomfortably by the door. Sully, maybe this is an opportunity for all of us to learn, to do better. Officer Martinez, Thompson turned to her. Your body cam footage from last night showed appropriate intervention. The department needs more officers willing to speak up when they witness potential misconduct. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across Chen's office. Sullivan felt exposed, as if the light was illuminating every flaw in his judgment, every unconscious bias he'd carried throughout his career. The press conference will address immediate actions, Chen continued. Sullivan, you'll be named, but we'll emphasize that you're on administrative leave pending investigation. Agent Thompson, will the FBI be making a separate statement? The Bureau will confirm the compromised investigation but won't provide details. We will, however, announce our broader inquiry into departmental practices. Sullivan stood slowly, his legs unsteady. Captain, what happens now? Chen's expression softened slightly. Go home, Sullivan. Rest. Reflect. The department psychologist will contact you to schedule mandatory sessions. Use this time to really think about last night. Not just what happened, but why it happened. As Sullivan moved toward the door, Thompson spoke again. Officer Sullivan, I don't believe you're a bad person. But good people can carry harmful biases. And those biases can have serious consequences. Last night could have ended very differently. The weight of those words followed Sullivan as he made his way through the back corridors of the precinct. Officers he'd worked with for years avoided his gaze or offered awkward nods. His locker, when he reached it, had already been tagged for investigation. Outside, through a small window, he could see the growing crowd of protesters. Their signs called for justice, reform, accountability. 23 years of service, and this would be his legacy. The officer who became a hashtag, whose mistake sparked a movement for change. Martinez appeared beside him as he gathered his personal items. "Need a ride home, Sully?" He nodded, grateful for the small kindness. As they walked to her personal car, she spoke softly. "Things are going to change around here. Maybe they need to." "Maybe they need to," Martinez continued, pulling out of the parking lot. "You know, when I first joined the force, you were one of my training officers. I learned a lot from you, Sully, but I also saw things, patterns I didn't want to acknowledge." Sullivan stared out the window, watching the protesters grow smaller in the side mirror. "I followed procedure, Jenny. Every stop, every arrest. It was all by the book." "Maybe that's the problem," she replied. "Maybe the book itself needs rewriting." The drive to Sullivan's apartment was filled with heavy silence. News vans lined his street, reporters already camped outside his building. Martinez circled the block, finding a back entrance through the service alley. "Thanks," Sullivan muttered, reaching for the door handle. "Sully," Martinez called as he stepped out. "This isn't the end. It's a wake-up call. For all of us." Inside his apartment, Sullivan turned on the TV only to see his own face plastered across every news channel. "Veteran NYPD officer detained FBI agent in racially charged incident," the headline screamed. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from family, friends, fellow officers, some supportive, others disappointed, many angry. He sank into his worn armchair, the events of the past 24 hours crashing over him. The badge that had defined his identity for over 2 decades was gone. His reputation, his career, everything he'd built, all hanging by a thread because of one incident. Or was it really just one incident? Thompson's words about patterns and statistics echoed in his mind. How many times had he made similar stops? How many citizens had he approached with the same preconceptions? How many times had his instincts been shaped by something darker than professional experience? His phone buzzed again, a text from Captain Chen. "Mandatory counseling starts tomorrow, 9 a.m. Dr. Rachel Wong's office. Don't be late." Sullivan closed his eyes, the weight of change pressing down on him. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more scrutiny, more soul-searching. But for now, in the gathering darkness of his apartment, he could only wonder how he'd never seen it before. The biases that had guided his actions, the prejudices he'd justified as procedure. The protests outside his building grew louder as night fell, their chants for justice and reform echoing through his windows. In 23 years of service, Sullivan had never felt more alone. Or more in need of change. 3 months later, the winter sun cast long shadows across Dr. Rachel Wong's office as Sullivan completed his final mandatory counseling session. The wall clock ticked steadily, marking time in a world that had shifted dramatically since that fateful night in Central Park. "How are you feeling about tomorrow's hearing, Michael?" Dr. Wong adjusted her glasses, her notepad balanced on her knee. "Nervous," Sullivan admitted, a word that would have been impossible for him to say 3 months ago. "But ready. I think I'm finally ready." The disciplinary hearing would determine his future with the NYPD, but somehow that wasn't his primary concern anymore. The past 3 months had been a journey of painful self-discovery and uncomfortable truths. "You've done significant work here," Dr. Wong observed. "Would you like to reflect on what's changed since our first session?" Sullivan leaned forward, his hands clasped. "I was angry at first. Defensive. I kept thinking about my record, my commendations, all the good I'd done. But now I understand, good intentions don't excuse harmful actions." He paused, remembering the breakthrough session when Agent Thompson had agreed to join them. That conversation had been transformative. "Officer Sullivan," Thompson had said, sitting across from him in Dr. Wong's office, "I want you to understand something. That night in the park, I wasn't just an FBI agent being profiled. I was every black man who's ever been stopped for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Every father who has to teach his sons how to survive encounters with law enforcement. Every professional who has to prove they belong in their own neighborhood. Those words had cracked something open in Sullivan's consciousness. The defensive walls he'd built over decades began to crumble. Back in the present, Dr. Wong nodded encouragingly. You've made remarkable progress in understanding systemic racism and your role in perpetuating it. How has this affected your view of policing? I've been doing a lot of community outreach, Sullivan replied. Working with the reform committee Captain Chen established. Learning from people I used to see as statistics. Their stories. They're changing everything I thought I knew about effective policing. The reform committee had been Chen's response to the FBI investigation. Sullivan's incident had indeed sparked broader changes within the department. New training protocols, community oversight boards, revised use of force policies, changes that would have seemed radical to him before. And your relationship with Agent Thompson? Sullivan smiled slightly. We meet weekly now. He's become a mentor, honestly. Helping me understand perspectives I was blind to before. We're working together on a training program for officers, sharing both sides of that night in the park. The program was their joint initiative, using their confrontation as a case study in bias awareness and de-escalation. It wasn't just about that one incident anymore. It was about transforming police culture from within. Tomorrow's hearing will be public, Dr. Wong reminded him. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? The public nature of my mistake demands a public acknowledgement, Sullivan said, echoing Thompson's words. I'm ready to take responsibility, not just for that night, but for the patterns of behavior that led to it. His phone buzzed, a text from Martinez. Committee meeting at 6. Bringing the new community liaison. You coming? Speaking of responsibility. Sullivan showed Dr. Wong the message. I should get going. The reform committee meets tonight. Dr. Wong closed her notepad. You've come a long way from the officer who first walked into my office. Michael, whatever happens tomorrow, remember that change is a continuous journey. Outside, the winter air was crisp. Sullivan walked to his car, noting how different the world looked now. The same streets, the same people, but his perspective had shifted fundamentally. At the precinct, the reform committee meeting was already underway. Community members, officers, and civil rights advocates sat together, working to rebuild trust and create new frameworks for policing. Sully, Martinez waved him over. Meet Marcus Williams, our new community liaison. The young black man extended his hand. Officer Sullivan, I've heard a lot about you. All bad, I hope, Sullivan joked, then grew serious. It's good to meet you, Mr. Williams. We have a lot of work to do. That we do, Williams agreed. But acknowledging the problem is the first step toward solving it. The meeting focused on implementing new protocols for community engagement. Sullivan listened more than he spoke, something that would have been unthinkable months ago. Each community member's perspective added another piece to his evolving understanding of true public service. Later that night, as he prepared for the hearing, Sullivan received another text, this time from Thompson. Remember what we talked about. Tomorrow isn't about punishment. It's about progress. Sullivan stared at the message, thinking about how far he'd come. The officer who had drawn his weapon in Central Park that night was a different person. Someone who couldn't see past his own biases, who confused authority with justice. He began writing his statement for the hearing, words flowing from a place of genuine reflection. 3 months ago, I made a mistake that exposed deep-rooted problems in our system and in myself. I stand before you not to defend those actions, but to demonstrate how they've led to necessary change. My journey of understanding isn't complete, but my commitment to reform is absolute. The city lights twinkled outside his window as he wrote, each word a step toward redemption. Tomorrow would bring judgment, but also opportunity, a chance to be part of the solution rather than perpetuating the problem. His phone buzzed one final time. Captain Chen. Whatever happens tomorrow, you've shown real growth. The department needs officers willing to acknowledge mistakes and work for change. Don't forget that. Sullivan finished his statement and prepared for bed, knowing tomorrow would be challenging but necessary. The badge he'd lost might never return. But perhaps he'd found something more valuable: the ability to see clearly, to change deeply, and to work toward genuine justice. In the quiet of night, he realized that his true service to the community might be just beginning, not as the officer he had been, but as the advocate for change he was becoming. 1 year later, the police academy auditorium buzzed with anticipation as cadets filed in for their final ethics and bias awareness training. At the podium, Sullivan adjusted his tie, no longer in uniform, but wearing his role as civilian instructor with a different kind of pride. "Good morning," he began, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "I'm Michael Sullivan. And with me today is FBI agent Marcus Thompson. We're here to share a story about a night that changed not just our lives, but the way we think about modern policing." Thompson stepped forward, his presence commanding respect. The two men exchanged a knowing look. Their unlikely partnership had become one of the most powerful teaching tools in the department's new training program. "Before we begin," Thompson addressed the cadets, "I want you to understand something. This isn't just another mandatory diversity training. This is about the future of law enforcement in our society." The lights dimmed as video footage from that fateful night played on the screen behind them. Sullivan watched the faces of the young cadets as they witnessed his mistake, their expressions shifting from shock to understanding. "That officer you see in the video," Sullivan continued after the footage ended, "thought he was doing his job. He had 23 years of experience, numerous commendations, and the respect of his peers. He also had something else: unconscious biases that had gone unchallenged for decades." The training session unfolded as a dialogue between Sullivan and Thompson, their personal experiences interweaving with broader discussions about systemic racism, community relations, and the evolving role of law enforcement. During the break, Captain Chen slipped into the back of the auditorium. She'd been instrumental in implementing the reforms that followed the incident, and the program had become a model for other departments across the country. "What we're building here," Thompson explained to the cadets, "is a new framework for policing. One that recognizes the humanity in every encounter, that questions assumptions, and that serves all communities equally." Sullivan shared the insights from his journey: the counseling sessions, the community meetings, the painful process of confronting his own prejudices. He spoke about the Reform Committee's achievements: body camera reforms, de-escalation protocols, community oversight boards, and the ongoing work still ahead. "The hardest part," he admitted, "wasn't losing my badge. It was realizing that everything I thought I knew about being a good police officer needed to be re-examined." A young cadet raised her hand. "Sir, do you regret what happened that night?" Sullivan paused, considering. "I regret my actions, absolutely. But I don't regret where they led me. Sometimes it takes a public failure to catalyze necessary change." After the session, Sullivan and Thompson met with Chen in her office. The walls were covered with news articles about the department's transformation. Positive headlines now, stories of progress and reform. "The FBI is interested in expanding the program nationally," Thompson announced. "They want us to develop a comprehensive training curriculum." Chen smiled. "You've both created something important here. The department's community satisfaction ratings are up 40% since we implemented these changes." Sullivan thought about how far they'd come. The protests that once surrounded the precinct had evolved into community dialogue sessions. The us versus them mentality was slowly being replaced by genuine partnership. "We're getting requests from other departments too," Chen continued. "They want to know how we managed to turn a potential crisis into an opportunity for real change." Later that evening, Sullivan attended a community advisory board meeting. Many faces were familiar now. People who had once protested against him were now working alongside him for reform. Marcus Williams, the community liaison, presented data showing reduced use of force incidents and improved response times in minority neighborhoods. This is what accountability looks like, he concluded. This is what happens when we work together. After the meeting, Sullivan walked through Central Park, the scene of his transformation. The Bethesda fountain sparkled in the evening light. Tourists and locals mingling peacefully. His phone buzzed with a text from Thompson. DC confirmed. They want us to present the program to the FBI Academy next month. Sullivan smiled, remembering their first hostile encounter in this very park. Now they were partners in reform, their story becoming a catalyst for change beyond New York. As he walked home, Sullivan reflected on the year's journey. He hadn't returned to active duty. That chapter of his life was closed. But he'd found a new purpose. One that might ultimately do more good than all his years carrying a badge. His apartment building came into view. No more protesters, no more news vans. Instead, a community garden had sprung up in the adjacent lot, a project he'd helped organize with local residents. Inside, he began preparing materials for tomorrow's training session. His phone lit up again, this time with a message from Dr. Wong. Saw your presentation today. You've come full circle. Ready to write that book we talked about? The book. Their discussions about documenting this journey of transformation had been gaining momentum. Not just his story, but a blueprint for systemic change in law enforcement. Sullivan opened his laptop and began typing. Change doesn't always come when we're ready for it. Sometimes it comes through confrontation, through failure, through the painful recognition of our own flaws. But if we're willing to learn, to grow, to transform our mistakes into momentum for progress, then even our darkest moments can lead to light. The city hummed outside his window, a different place than it had been a year ago. Not perfect, but moving forward. Just like him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for reform, new chances to bridge the gaps between law enforcement and community. But for the first time in his career, Sullivan felt truly aligned with his purpose. Not as a symbol of authority, but as a catalyst for change. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But now he understood that true justice requires constant evolution, uncomfortable conversations, and the courage to admit when we're wrong in order to find a better way forward.